Welcome to episode 34 of the Silver Savage podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Masada Tactical. Check out masadatactical.com for information about classes, seminars, and gear. With recent events associated with police brutality, we decided to discuss and tackle this issue. Looking at recent events from the lens of police officers, and more so as instructors who teach police, we are discussing recent events, legislation, and more. Here's episode 34 discussing police brutality with Steve and BK. Steven.
And BK, here we go again.
I don't hear you saying often. I kind of miss it.
I got
All right, but yeah, we always say Lucifer is an angel too, right?
Angel.
But all joking aside, we actually have a very serious topic to talk about today. Something we've been discussing in the office a little bit, and an issue that's been actually around for years now, but obviously resurfaced this past week, and that is the topic of police action, specifically what is often referred to as police brutality, when it is, when it isn't, and what are some of the, I guess, events, consequences. How does that affect society as a whole, and what can we, as people that spend the majority of our careers training law enforcement, what are we learning from it, and how are we evolving to meet these demands and needs, if it needs to be met, right? Because I'm sure we'll talk about it, but we have a very small minority, point something of percent, right, that are affecting the way all police are being viewed, and that is, I think, the bigger issue, right? But let's go into some of the main points of this most recent event.
And before we do, because you brought up a good point, right? You said a small percentage of law enforcement, right? When you look at the actual numbers, there's close to 1 million, if not more, uniformed law enforcement officers. If you include uniformed federal, it's over 1 million, right? We see a handful, and again, for all our listeners, I am not justifying, these acts, but we're talking about less than 1%, right, of officers that are doing this. And I don't even want to call them police officers, because the ones who are obviously nefarious in their actions are criminals with badges. People fall through the cracks, etc. And I think that's something we can talk about too. Why does that happen, right?
Right, and I will say every profession has its bad apples, right? It just happens to be because the nature of their profession that when police officers do something wrong, it obviously takes them front lines. I mean, we have doctors with malpractice, we have accountants that are taking advantage of their clients, stockbrokers that are taking advantage. We have those happening throughout with any profession out there, and it's not till police officers do it that we see it in the front headlines type thing.
But you know what? In a way, I get why. We're both police officers. At least you still are. I was. And one thing that I memorized, and I would recite to the recruits, and I'd always ask this, and you probably did the same with your recruits when you were teaching for the state. I'd ask the simple question: "What's your job?" Right? And 99.9% of the time, you get your new recruit raising their hands to enforce the law. No, yes, but that's not your primary job. I always say, what is your first and foremost primary job? Oh, to protect property. No, and no one would ever get it. There'd be that one or two, person who read their actual annotated code of Maryland or books. And it actually says the primary responsibility of a law enforcement official is the preservation of life, through the enforcement of law and the protection of property. It doesn't matter if it's an innocent person or a criminal suspect. Once we engage with that suspect, we are responsible for that person's life, right? And I think I won't say every, I think that gets misconstrued and it gets forgotten, it gets thrown to the curb. I was a firm believer in it when I became a police officer because I experienced bad cops growing up, But for me, it was I wanted to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. I didn't want to be the person just screaming foul, pointing fingers. I wanted to become the police officer that didn't exist for me and be the one that I wish I had growing up. And unfortunately, we'll get into it now with the most recent Mr. Nichols. Um, More details are coming out from the story. regardless of what the background of that story is, let's focus on the actual actions of the police officer, right? An innocent, I want to say
Yeah,
an innocent.
and we got to be clear. I'm sorry, Steve.
Yeah,
We got to be clear for our listeners to say that this is fresh. There's a lot of information that's still coming up. We are not here to pass judgment on anything we
no,
don't know. We are not here to judge anybody. Obviously, we have our opinion, and we'll be very honest about it. But um, there's still a lot of information that's coming out on a daily basis right now, and this is all preliminary and our opinion only. There is no. I don't want anybody saying, but BK and Steve said so, so it must be true. It is. We're not there in the
no,
flow of events just yet.
not at all. And again, whether he was innocent or guilty of the actions, we're speaking on the actual tactics that the officers used. We both saw the videos. I'll be honestly, I was mortified when I saw it. I dropped a lot of what the f's are they doing? That's crazy. And it's unfortunate, that the other officers there either didn't stop it and actually participated. And I know we try to avoid politics, but what did I say when we were watching that video? I said, "Oh my God, it looks like a replay of the Rodney King beating." I mean, it was insane. And
So
look,
to let's recap it for listeners, because some people they may be living under a rock, but some people may not know all the information. To just big picture, like 30,000 feet view. Um, tell the listeners what actually happened
okay, so from what
that we
I
know.
understood, it was Memphis, right?
Yeah, Memphis PD.
Yeah, it was a group of officers. I believe they were plainclothes officers, but they were wearing marked outer vest carriers. There are some kind of street squad, jump out squad, or something like that. They attempted to stop this individual before he escaped their custody. They caught up with him again, and quote unquote attempted to take him into custody once more. Um, these officers had body worn camera, and there was actually outside commercial cameras that caught the incident on tape, on media. But as far as I could see, I did not. And again, I don't work for Memphis. I don't know what their policies, regulations are. Typically, they're general across the board ish. When it comes to defensive tactics and control tactics. But that looked like a straight up personal beatdown to me, from what I saw, and what these
And
officers.
we learned right, and we learned that there was some history there, right? There
Yeah,
was
yeah. So,
a trigger.
yeah, Mr. Nichols worked with one of the main officers' child's mother. So I don't know if there was a romantic relationship or something. Again, I don't know the details. That was one of the recent details that came out. Again, not an excuse for anything, but this police officer obviously abused his authority and used it, to get back at Mr. Nichols, and from what I understand, again, I don't know the in-depth nature of Mr. Nichols. I didn't look into it, but from what I've seen so far, he was not someone with a criminal history. He did have medical conditions. He was a skateboarder, a prominent skateboarder. He was friendly in the neighborhood. There was nothing nefarious to him. Not that even if there was, that justified that kind of actions from the police officers. But that's what we're seeing. And again, the actions of these police officers was, in my opinion, horrendous. I was taken aback, as I'm sure 99.9% of the police officers who believe in this job, when they see that, I'm sure they were like, holy shit, what are they doing? What are they thinking? They're thugs with badges. You know what I mean?
Yep. And my background here in America when it comes to working with police all started by teaching defensive tactics for state commission, and as the lead defensive tactics instructor, right, for a state agency, and that's where I met you, right. um
Yeah, you
I'm
punched,
watching the video. Sorry.
yeah, you punched me in the face.
I did punch you in the face and you loved it, and then you punched me back. But with that said, I'm watching the video, and again, first time I watched the video, you were with me, and the person is on the ground and he's being kicked in the head, he's being punched. He's not, I don't want to say it doesn't seem to be resistant because you can't see, but whatever level of resistance he did show, they certainly did not amount to officers needing to exercise that level of force, right? There's a very basic continuum that we teach officers, right? If bad guy does A, you can do A. If they do B, you can do B, C, C, and D, D, and so forth, right? and it varies from agency to agency and from unit to unit. Um, but I would say at no agency that I've ever worked with, I've seen compliant, or I would say maybe resistant, but certainly not assaultive individual being on the ground and where the policy warrants strikes towards the head. I've seen a baton very obviously being extended and used to strike the person. It seemed as it was towards the head or upper back area, right? We've
Which is
seen
deadly force, in your charts, in your striking charts.
Right. So for our listeners that don't know, there are two main manufacturers of expendable batons that police uses, right? One is ASP, the other one is Monadnock. There are other brands and there's other curriculums, but those are the two prevalent ones. So I assume Memphis PD, being a large department, would fall into one of those. The only difference, so sorry, and each one of those training curriculums would have a diagram of a person with what's considered to be a green zone, typically limbs, extremity, muscular areas. There's yellow zones, which are for more aggressive type individuals, which are joints for the most part, elbows, knees, to get someone to stop fighting. And then there are red zones, which are considered deadly force, which includes the head, neck, and so forth. And I think the only difference between monadnock and asp is whether the groin is red or yellow.
Right.
It's red on one, it's yellow on the other.
Yeah. Head,
Um,
neck, spine are red zones considered deadly force, and like you said, the groin is the
yeah,
yellow or red.
yeah. So they're hitting this person in the head, which obviously this guy is not posing a deadly threat on any of them at that point. He's on the ground, and I think you mentioned to me that the audio actually at some point states that he's saying they tell him to get on the ground. He's like, I am on the ground. He's trying to comply, yet they keep hitting him. Right? He's being tased. He got sprayed. Um, Five officers against one, that is a level of force, right? So just numerically, there's
Correct.
probably other skills that could be utilized to subdue an individual. So on all accounts, regardless of the background, this is a bad day. This is a bad day. It's a bad day for Mr. Nichols, which subsequently passed 3 days later. He was in critical condition. I found out today that the EMTs and firefighters that attended were also fired due to not conducting a proper trauma assessment and dealing with it correctly. Um, and then the officers got terminated. And then um, once Mr. Nichols passed, they were officially arrested and charges of being filed. And obviously, it's going to be a big deal moving forward because, unfortunately, in America, um, this becomes immediately a racial or a social issue. And mind you, the officers were all black. The suspect, Mr. Nichols, I'm calling a suspect because at that point he was being detained for something. I think it started with like a traffic violation.
I believe so.
Um, but they were all black. They're all African American. I don't believe there was a racial motive behind it. It seemed to be a personal motive and a gang mentality in the sense that we have five officers that work together
In a
against
tight
one.
knit.
Yeah, exactly. Tight knit. Because one person had a beef with him, right?
Right.
But brothers will be brothers, and in this sense, it was a bad thing where they worked out to cover to assist one of their own. From your experience, let me ask you, I'm putting you in the hot chair for a second because you work in a very large metropolitan police
Mhm.
department. I work in a more rural, smaller one. Um, how how prevalent is this tight knit, nefarious intending group mentality? Because recently there was a TV show on HBO, right, about a Baltimore City
Correct.
unit from
We
the
have a monster or whatever they call it.
yeah, on the city. That was the name of the show.
But we
Similar idea, right? Tight knit team that did illegal activity.
um obviously years ago I think it was more prevalent. Now is not so much because there's a lot more accountability, right? And obviously with more media, to see what's going on, it's harder for unfortunate police officers that are have nefarious intentions. It's easier for them to get caught. But does it exist? I will say, especially now that I'm retired, yeah, absolutely. Again, when I came to my agency, and I'm not going to name it just for the namesake because they're wonderful officers. It is a good agency um, overall, but within in those smaller structures, like you said, in those tight knit units, that exists. The cronyism, the favoritism, and I'll even say the racism because I experienced it. As a Hispanic officer, when I came on the agency, there were maybe five Spanish speaking officers at the time of an agency of almost 700, if not more. And not only that, I wasn't quote unquote, and this term is a prevalent term, I wasn't homegrown. I wasn't from here. I was an outsider coming in. I didn't have another term that I hated hearing, a legacy. I wasn't somebody's dad, or I mean, somebody's son or nephew or uncle, which you see a lot of as well. And those are the people that, get into those specialized units and whatnot. And mind you, I got into it. I had a very, very amazing career. I had very diverse career. I got to work in a lot of places, but I had to bust my ass for it. It wasn't because I knew somebody. It's because I did my job and I did it well. But to answer your question and not go off on a tangent, yeah, it exists. It does exist,
Right.
unfortunately. And not all it's not always bad all the time. You know what I mean? But that tight knit cohesiveness, especially in these smaller units, it exists.
I was about to say it's not always a negative things, and even when it comes to negative things, it's typically minor things,
Mhm.
and it's interesting. As I'm saying it, I'm thinking, where do you draw the line, right? So, if a guy, I'm gonna use one example that I was familiar with because it happened to a team of people that I know where one guy would split off a shift to go meet a girlfriend or something, right? And everybody else would cover for him. Nothing illegal, nothing wrong happening, no casualties, no injuries,
No,
nobody
no, not
got
at all.
hurt. But yet, but yet it's against policy and everybody's covering for the one individual, right?
Right.
On the flip side, you do have the very positive element. As both of us come from military, and within the military, we were in specialized units, and then transitioning to policing. When you have a unit that is very intimate with each other, that works very closely with each other, they work a lot better.
They
Um,
do.
and oftentimes there's a benefit for it, right? You are my brother, and if you and I have to hit a house, I know which way you will go, I know which way I will go, I know, I will have your back
Right.
100% of the time, on the account of my own life if I need to. And that goes for something. So when you take that tight knit, that support of each other, that love to each other, and you turn it to a negative goal, such as in Mr. Nichols' case, where I feel there was a peer pressure element there where one person, maybe two, started it, and then everybody else just because of the nature of the team, right? You said that it was a jump out unit squad type thing, right? And again, we don't know for sure,
Like,
but right, but they have that same mentality, like, I'm gonna have your back, right? Because 99.9% of the time, that's a positive thing, right? This just happened to be a very negative thing.
right. And you know what else? I'm not saying it's the case in this particular call, but we've seen this social change, right? In law enforcement, right? They become the enemy. It's like this us against them, which is not good. Not good for the individual officer, not good for society, period. Again, 99.9% of police officers are there to do their job, to take a to give their life for the perfect stranger. Hundreds, if not thousands, have already done it. If you've never been to it as a civilian, go to the law enforcement memorial. It is somber. Go to the museum, see for yourself the people who have sacrificed their lives, men and women, for perfect strangers, and they're still out there today. It's crazy because in my law enforcement career, because I've had the haters, oh, you're a cop, I don't want to talk to you, this and that. I thankfully never had to take a life in my law enforcement career, but I lost count of how many lives I got to save, and that was the highlight of my law enforcement career. From the baby choking to the person in emotional distress, and talking about as a hostage negotiator or a crisis intervention specialist. That was my highlight. That's why I became a police officer. And I believe the majority of police officers, that's why they do it. You know, you might get the young rookie who jokes about, I became a cop to shoot guns and drive fast. But the reality is, you'll probably never do that in your law enforcement career. You know, it's not often that that happens, you know. And the problem is, and I used to say this when I ran the recruitment unit, when I had that opportunity, was unfortunately there's this perception that the 1% of things that happen, we mark it as the 99% of things that happen. You know, like what we actually do is not actually shown, and what we rarely ever do is what's broadcasted. And I started this revolution, I guess you could say, because you look at old recruitment videos from police departments, they always show the SWAT teams jumping out, the cars driving fast, the officer running and shooting. And the fact of the matter is, you know, and I used to tell recruits, you're going to fight boredom more than you're going to fight crime. And that's a good day. If you were bored your entire day and nothing happened, that is a successful day in law enforcement. It is not how Hollywood perceives it. And, you know, where you have a 20-year career compacted into an hour and a half movie, and you can surmise what movie I'm talking about. But unfortunately, that's how society sees it, and it's not like that. And not only that, and before I get off my horse here, because you know I'll get emotional and passionate about this, they forget that police officers are human. You know, there's mothers that go home to their kids to cook dinner, do laundry. You know, fathers that they walk through the door and got to change dirty diapers, got to fix the, you know, the hole in the wall, have to take their kids to soccer and be normal after seeing all this visual, you know, trauma and experiencing physical trauma, which, you know, we can go off on a tangent talking about that, but that's not what we're talking about today. We'll save that for another podcast because I'll probably need some Kleenexes for that one. And we might have to bring Serena on. But people forget that we're human beings, we're not robots, and unfortunately, that's what society wants: robots. You know, there is a human factor to it, and like I like to say, anything that's human influence or human made is going to fail. It's going to fail.
100%. And we're going to talk about what society wants in a second, because I think I wanted to use this podcast as an opportunity to also discuss uh, what became known as the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, right? Because that was a result of similar actions, right? So and it's getting resurfaced now. But I want to touch on something you said prior, and that's about recruits, right? You talk about, you used to ask your recruits what's the mission of a police officer. I used to ask my recruits, being a defensive tactics instructor, the very first time I would have them in my class, I would ask them, why do you want to be a cop? And to your point, I can't tell you how many people I had say, I want to drive fast, I want to shoot guns, and I want to be able to get away with it. I'm like, well, you're in the wrong profession and you're doing it for the wrong reasons, and you should not be a police officer, right? So you're right. There's a Hollywood factor, there's a romanticism factor that goes with policing, and for the most part, we do, a thankless job for people that don't care about us for very little money. To be honest, police officers not getting paid a lot, they work a lot of overtime just to meet, you know to make ends meet. It's a tough job, and for all those that criticize police officers, and again, I don't want to say that we're perfect. There's a lot of incidents happening recently, um, but they're done by a very small percentage of the majority, right? But for everybody that criticizes policing, I would argue, walk in their shoes for a day, and and it's easy to do. Just go on a ride along in your local jurisdiction, sit in a cruiser with a police officer for a few hours and see what they deal with and what they do, and then draw your own conclusions. Watching cops is not experiencing policing. um, One more thing that you touched about, and I know I'm going on a tangent as well, but you talk about fighting boredom. As you know, we teach a lot of verbal de-escalation, and we work a lot with healthcare, with some corporations. And when I start my discussion, I tell them a little bit my background, which does not correlate at all to their background. The reason I say that and I tell them is, what I needed to understand is that I deal with people that want to drive over me with a car, shoot me, stab me, fight me every day. And every day that I can walk away without having to draw my gun is a good day. Drawing my gun is not my intended resolution. Tasing someone is not my intended resolution. Going hands on is not my intended resolution. As a police officer specific, as a human being, but as a police officer specifically, I'd walk away from any fight and any opportunity if I can de-escalate a situation. That is such a better option for all people in the
Yeah,
mix, right?
right. And what happens too is, like you say, with again, I'm a believer in reform, right? There has to be change because society changes, technology changes, everything changes. There has to be change. In my law enforcement career, I probably experienced three significant changes, and I was okay with it. It's a matter of how you perceive it, and it falls on your leaders too as to how they interpret it and pass it on to their troops. And I think there's a big problem there too, because I can speak on that. Excuse my language. I can speak on that shit for hours.
And we did a whole podcast about leadership, and we talked about policing and issues, right? But
yes,
and sorry to cut you short, but you're right in the sense that leadership has to back whatever reform they're changing. If I'm going to ask a police officer to do something, first of all, I need to lead by example. I need to back them up where that reform works, and I specifically need to back them up where the reform didn't work and they find themselves in hot water. Because otherwise, that's an issue, right? I mean, we have major agencies right now, and I'm going to pinpoint to Baltimore Police Department just because it's an agency
they're a
in our
neighbor.
state.
Yeah,
Yeah, last numbers I heard are over 1,000 officers short from the regular numbers, and that
it's getting
is
worse
who
and
wants to
worse.
be a cop. Yeah, when you have officers on the media and everybody associates the rest of the world with those police officers, why would anybody want to be a cop? And that's a vicious cycle because now you have less people that want to be police officers, so crime is rampant. Then police officers can't do their job, which is exaggerating the problem. And then they're trying to do their job, but we're hiring less capable individuals and not to there are some people going into policing for the right reason and they're doing a very tough job, but a lot of people go to it because it is a job with benefits and a paycheck, and but they're not trained well enough, and oftentimes they're the makeup of the community. We have gang members that are now joining the police force, and we expect them to enforce the law. It's not going to happen,
No,
and it's just going to make things worse, right?
and 100.
So
percent Go ahead. Finish what you were saying.
So I want to go into this Reform Act, if that's okay. I'm going to mention some of the key points that the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act was suggested to be. Now, to give people a little bit of background, this was in 2021. The Democratic Party was trying to pass it. They were able to pass it internally, but the end it got in a split house. It got stalled and off the table. But there's a lot of people calling for it now again following these events in Memphis. So these are just some of the points because this is a very in-depth act, right? But I want to mention some of the main points, and if we can, Steve, kind of discuss some of them. So the first one is granting power to the Justice Department and Civil Rights Division to issue subpoenas to police department as part of a pattern of practice investigation, which means now you have a federal agency overseeing local, state, county police agencies, right? And essentially having the right to subpoena any information about anything that's going on, specifically as it comes to patterns and practice of bias and misconduct by the department. So, what are your thoughts on that? I actually don't think that is necessarily bad. Now, I may not be reading this 100% correctly, but in having some sort of an oversight for biases, I don't see a negative.
No, absolutely. And here's the funny thing, because people think, oh, this doesn't happen. I can tell you right now, since I became a cop, over 20 years ago, that's already been happening. It's funny because I'll talk to people who I use this term, you know, non offensively, are ignorant. Um, because when they say, well, you guys should do this, and I'll speak specifically for our agency, I responded to this person like, well, we've been doing that for the last 10 years. And they're like, what? So people don't realize, just like, not to change the subject, when people are like, well, we need background checks when you buy a gun. We already have background checks when you buy guns, you know? So there's a lot of
Loopholes.
Yeah, people don't know. So I can tell you right now, from the day I became a police officer, and even as a local officer, I had to fill out what was called every traffic stop was they don't exist anymore because it's all digitally collected. A data sheet. It was a traffic safety stop data sheet. And for those who know what I'm talking about, probably rolling their eyes, are like, "Oh my god!" It took probably 15 minutes to circle every little bubble. But the idea of it was to collect data on biases, right? Or socioeconomics, like with the disparages and stuff like that. So that's been happening already. And not only that, when it comes to federal oversight or interjection, that happens too. You know what I mean? If an event reaches a certain level, they don't have to subpoena anything. Most local agencies are requesting the help already because a lot of times they don't have the resources, and they know the federal government does. The law, I think sometimes, like you said, politicians like to politicize it and say it and put it in front of people to say, "Look what I'm doing." But a majority of time, it already exists, and people don't understand. Like, and I always like to use the example. Unfortunately, I say this unfortunately, but fortunately, I I've testified against quite a few officers in my career, and thankfully, my agency held them accountable. Officers that I trained and became cops, that were fired, and it's crazy because a lot of times, even as an instructor, because they were meeting those check marks and stuff like that, and I did a good job of documenting it. I usually knew who wasn't going to make it, and not necessarily for a nefarious action, just in general, But there were some that I wasn't surprised when they did something stupid and they were fired, you know. But the statistics are misconstrued because, as you know, a lot of times if it's an internal infraction and there's no criminal charges, you can resign in lieu of being terminated, right? So it doesn't look like you were fired, and the statistics doesn't look like we got rid of a cop for doing something bad. But that's only because there was no criminal charge. If there's criminal charges, obviously they're going to be terminated and they're going to be charged criminally, whether it's DUI, which I have seen, falsifying reports, which I have seen, excessive force, which you and I have both testified as defensive tactics experts in cases against officers. There is a lot of accountability that politicians and or the media don't talk about because it doesn't meet that agenda. So that back to that point, yeah, that's happening. It's happened.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm going to throw one more point because you bring a good point about testifying against police officers. We both had to do it as part of our jobs as defensive tactics instructors. Also know both of us had the opportunities to be expert witness on use of force in other cases. And oftentimes personally, my choice is I like to defend police officers' use of force because
Absolutely.
they're being put in bad positions oftentimes. I'll mention one example of a deputy sheriff in the state that was working in a correctional facility and was getting terminated because he ended up punching um, an inmate that was in handcuffs. And by policy, you're not supposed to punch anybody that's in handcuffs. What was omitted is that this person was overly aggressive, was under the influence of something, which I don't know how he got in the facility, in the institution, already fractured another officer's knee in the same incident and was not coming down. So the level of force obviously shows that the person is still a threat, is still capable of inflicting serious bodily harm. And a strike in that point was a matching level of force. We were able to save that deputy's job and prove him right. So, that goes both ways. But I agree with 100%. A lot of things happens and people don't know. So let me move to the next one. Provide grants to state attorney generals to create an independent process to investigate misconduct or excessive use of force by police officers. So that's just money going to state attorney generals. I have an issue with state attorney generals in general speaking because they're very politically driven.
Yes, they're like,
Um, yeah, so that's the problem. If he was a third party objective individual and the funds were, let's do an objective investigation of the event, I'll be perfectly fine with that. I think where it's a state attorney general, which is politically as an agenda, that is in my mind not fair. It is not. It puts out there about, and I'll throw one more. I know you're trying to say something, but I'll throw one more in. I know your agency, your former agency, does it as well as a bunch of other agencies in the state. When there's any lethal force event, the attorney general places that video for public viewing on YouTube, before that officer ever had a chance to go for any due process. So now we have officers being judged by the public and the media before they had a chance to even defend their actions. And when you put a scene up, a very short clip, without the context, we have major issues and a lot of gray areas that oftentimes work against the police officers when it shouldn't.
Agreed, and and I have both sides to talk on this one, right? Because um, my former agency, they had a policy, and I get it. The powers that be are trying to be transparent. So if an officer was charged with a criminal offense, they would actually send an email out to the entire police department saying this officer was charged with this, which was this is again they're guilty before proven innocent, and this is what society doesn't know. When you're in law enforcement, you're not innocent until proven guilty. You're guilty until proven innocent, and unfortunately, unlike the judicial system for the civilians in law enforcement, and I know in this state, I don't know about any other state, the preponderance of the evidence is enough to convict you. So hearsay is okay. It doesn't have to be proven true or not, and it's unfortunate, even worse now with Leo bar rights being eliminated. Now, going back to review boards, I know we have in the state now civilian review boards. Now, I'm not necessarily opposed to civilian review boards if they are properly selected. A diverse group. Go
And
ahead.
trained. Somebody's got to, I said trained. Somebody's got to explain to them how
Correct.
police officers are being trained, what's their curriculum like, what are they being taught. Now go ahead and take that information and judge their action.
So they should be properly trained. Our department has a civilian police academy which educates them on the police department. They do our community relations unit does an outstanding job of convincing people of all walks of life, of all political walks of life, to come through our Citizens Police Academy and understand what we do. So they one thing about my agency, it is very progressive, and that I did like about it. But the Civilian Review Board, again, I'm not opposed to it because one thing I told my troops as a supervisor, because these young officers were worried, right? I'm gonna be thrown in jail for doing my job, no Leo bar rights, this and that, blah, blah. And I would tell them, I said, listen, in over 20 years of law enforcement, I've never had to invoke my Leo bar rights. And I would ask them, do you know why? They're like, why? Because
Because
I
they didn't do
did
anything
my
wrong.
because I did my job the way I'm supposed to do it, and then I remind them, because you think about it. If someone goes into law enforcement at the age you're allowed to go and you're 21, for a male, your brain isn't even developed yet, right? Your mom is still buying you underwear. Then again, my mom still buys me underwear. But anyway, and there's nothing wrong with that. Okay. You judge me if you want.
It's
She's
a
my
lot
mom.
cheaper.
You can't stop her from being your mom. But they're young, right? You give them this badge, right? You're giving them a sense of power, right? And essentially, whether you believe in God or not, you're giving them this godlike complex because you have this authority, if justified, to take someone's life, right?
Not
And
only life, take someone's freedom, which is a
freedom,
power that
which is even
nobody else has, right? Not even the president of America can take someone's freedom away.
so
That's
so
something that a 21-year-old kid can go and take someone's freedom away,
right.
which is huge.
So how do you put that in check? Because there's the human element that we forget about. And I would remind them again, I was that guy who actually read the annotated code of Maryland, and I would go back and tell them it specifically says in the police department, and it all started with when law enforcement was really being attacked. People were going out there saying thank you for what you do, thank you for your service, and I would respond, no, thank you for letting me serve you. And they would look at me like I had three heads. Like, what are you talking about? And then I would explain to the recruits and these people in the annotated code of Maryland, it specifically states a police department exists because the citizens allow it to exist to execute a service on their behalf. And I would tell these recruits that you're not above them, you're there for them, and you have to keep telling yourself that. And again, that gets lost, and that goes back to leadership, structure, training, etc. Continue.
Right. Well, I appreciate it. I'm reading through all these notes here, and there's actually a bunch of them. Some of them are very repetitive. Also, noticing that a lot of them have to say specifically federal police officer with uniformed officer, which is interesting because I heard of a lot of local and state police officers being against it, where it doesn't really apply to them. But let me put that part aside for a second. Just talk generally. I want to touch really on three main ones because there's a bunch of them here. The first one is enhance accountability for police officers who commit misconduct by restricting the application of the qualified immunity doctrine, right, for local and state officers, and by changing the mens rea intent. So, for those that don't know, in order for me to prove a crime, I need to prove two things, which is intent and ability, right? So, by changing the mens rea, the intent element, the federal criminal offense of deprivation of rights under color of law, which has been used to prosecute police for misconduct from willfully to knowingly or with reckless disregard. So essentially, for people that don't understand what qualified immunity is, essentially there's a lot of things that come with our job that we are protected because of the nature of what we do. And this would take that protection away, right? So essentially everything that as a police officer I'm going to do automatically may make me a criminal. And that's an issue.
And here's the thing, you said it. People have this misconception because I heard it thrown around a lot in the media. Oh, they have immunity. They have immunity. They can get away with murder. They can get away with anything. And nothing could be further from the truth. Again, this is that ignorance, right? And I have to explain this to my own family. Like I am not immune from anything. This is if I stay within the scope of my authority, within the scope of my rules and regulations. I did everything I'm supposed to do, and there is some unfortunate incident, I'm protected from that unfortunate incident because I stayed within the lines. If I step out of the lines, there are accountability processes in place to hold me accountable. For all this time, people were throwing around this qualified immunity like we had this blank pass to do whatever the hell we wanted. And nothing could be further from the truth. There's this misconception of that idea, but that's gone now.
Right.
It's unfortunate.
Yep. I can't get away with anything I want.
Well, that's true. But even within the scope
Right.
of my duties, you got officers that have to,
But the problem is,
go ahead. Rock, paper, scissors.
no, no, sorry, I lost.
There you go.
I lost you for a second. I'm saying the whole idea of qualified immunity, obviously, there's things like you say, like taking someone's life. That is, I can't just go and shoot people because I want to and be covered by this qualified immunity. That doesn't work. And you're right, people are uneducated about it. But we talk about taking someone's liberties away, right? There's defending myself. There's elements about it. Now, when this says between the difference between willingly and knowingly, you know, how often did you know for certain that something is going on? And how often did you have to work on a hunch, right? Or on hearsay, or just because you've been on the job long enough and experience has taught you that. And those elements taken away would make your action illegal.
And that's the thing, as criminals, there's patterns to criminal right to criminal actions. There's patterns, and as you progress in your law enforcement career, you understand these patterns, right? You understand the actions. So you do, it starts with a hunch, right? And that hunch becomes reasonable suspicion, and that reasonable suspicions becomes probable cause, and then that probable cause will lead to an arrest, an investigation, whatever it may be. So there is a hierarchy to it, right? Just like use of force.
Reasonable cause, yeah, probable cause.
And that doesn't change. Like it's like, I mean, then again, in this society, anything can change now because everything from biology to God knows what is no longer what it is. But a criminal's a criminal action is the same. If I see someone break a
Can't bring
window,
God into this.
yeah, if I see someone walking down a strip mall, throw a brick into a window at a storefront that's closed, that's criminal activity. You know what I mean? It's not anything else but that. Or if all these stores are closed and I see someone walking around tugging on doors, all right, they're not a security guard, they don't have any markings or anything like that. Obviously, I'm going to go, over there and see what's going on. And that's just a very minute, redundant, example. But as you do this job, for time and time again, it the criminal element is the criminal element. You're gonna understand it, how it works, what it looks like, and you're going to direct your attention to it. You
Right.
can't change that.
Right. And that's the thing that qualified immunity kind of was intended, in my understanding, to protect. Where now, if that's taken away, then essentially puts all these obstacles in your way to try to preserve the law, right? And ultimately, as you said, preserve human life, because you don't know where that's going to lead. So you cannot do your job. And then if you didn't do your job, that becomes your fault as well, right? All right, I'm going to move on to the next. I said there's two more, so actually I'm going to have three more. One of them is the use of funds. So let me find the exact one. Restrict the transfer of military equipment to police. So specifically, what the reference is for armored vehicles, like Bearcats type thing. Um, I know my agency has Humvees. By nature of being in an area that is prone to hurricanes, and in those senses, those vehicles are the only thing that's going to make it through. Uh, so those tools, because they're classified as military tools, are going to be restricted, and law enforcement will not be able to get them, which I think is not right. You've been on SWAT. I've been on SWAT, and we know that there are certain events. The lines between military and police are very blurry nowadays. Police is required to do hostage rescue. They're required to do active shooter response. They're doing all this what would be considered a paramilitary operation, right? But we're not going to give them the tools to do so. And that's how are you going to execute a proper barricade or a hostage rescue without having the tools to do so? So that
And,
is certainly an issue in my mind.
and you know what? Let's
Anything.
break it down even more in layman's terms, because again, this goes back to what I said before: ignorance, misinformation, propaganda. I blame the media. I blame politicians, right? Because they wanted to end this program. So people automatically assume, oh my God, we're giving tanks to the police. Oh my God, we're giving them howitzers or artillery pieces. No, through this program,
You
I
got
know.
howitzers?
Yeah, right. I through this program, I know agencies that got tourniquets, they got surplus medical equipment. You know what I mean? That was discarded. And you said, like you said, utilitarian vehicles. Yeah, Humvees. Guess what? You could go to your dealership and buy a Humvee. You know what I mean? It's not.
I wouldn't be able to save lives in my jurisdiction. If there's a hurricane where I am at, if I do not have a Hummer, I cannot
You're not
go
going to make
and
it
reach
there.
those people, God forbid.
Right. Even the basic firearm, there's some agencies that can't afford their sidearms, and through these programs, they're able to equip their officers, through surplus military equipment. They have this misconception that this program is, giving hydrogen bombs and F-16s to local police departments to terrorize the people. Again, that's not the intended concept of this program. It's to give functional equipment to aid in their mission as local law enforcement officers. And again, back to the preservation of life. Vehicles like deuces and a halves and 5 tons and Humvees during floods. You look at all these flood situations down south in Texas and other places. You see these military vehicles and local law enforcement using the same vehicles acquired through these programs. They're not functional weapons of war. They're functional tools, utilitarian tools for these local that have been converted in most cases to function as civilian and for law enforcement. Again, misinformation, misunderstanding, and ignorance.
Right, 100%. Next point. So I got two left. Next point is about body worn cameras. Requires police officers to have body worn cameras. I'm actually not opposed to that. Like you said before, if I'm doing everything right, I have nothing to hide. More often than not, it would protect me in the sense that I'll be able to justify my actions. So I'm actually not opposed to this specific point. Um, those police officers in Memphis, their body cam footage is now all of them have been turned in, and it's gonna incriminate them, and
Yep.
that's their own damn fault for doing illegal actions.
Yep.
So I'm actually not opposed at all to body worn cameras by all officers. Do you have
Yep.
any objection?
I was never opposed to it. I had a lot of officers who opposed it,
Are
and
you
as
there?
yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me? Hello, hello, come in. There you are. I had a lot of my officers that opposed it. Um, I never opposed it. Are you there? Hello.
Yeah, yeah, I'm
Okay.
here. I'm hearing you.
Oh, it looked like you were
Hello,
playing with
I'm
yourself or
hearing you.
something. I thought you were playing with yourself.
I look like a what?
You look like you were playing with yourself, like in that
Play with
way.
myself? No, I'm
Yeah.
not.
Hey, so I had a lot of officers
My
that
hands are
opposed.
up here. You get to.
Officers that oppose it, but like you said, I actually got to witness the opposite. What I'm going to personally say as the opposite intended effect that these politicians thought that it would have. So a lot of criminals, once they knew they were being recorded, they started acting right. They started being respectful. They started complying, which is a word that gets thrown around a lot and not used correctly. Not only that, they exonerated a lot of officers in these false accusations. Because just pull the camera. And you're required to say you're being recorded and who you are and this and that. And again, there's there's two things to the cameras that I like to talk about. One, yes, I like the camera. I was never opposed to it. But the one thing the camera does not catch is the human aspect, the emotion that the officer is going through, the physiological response. So it's kind of, one dimensional because you're interpreting what you see, but you have no idea what the officer is feeling either.
I agree. I think no technology is ever going to be perfect, but I honestly think the positive outweighs the negative in this case.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And,
Agree.
yeah, and when people are, I think it's a knee-jerk reaction to okay, there's something that's being mandated on police, so we automatically opposed to it. This is one of those things that take a step back and look about all the actions that police do that could be justified because they have that body worn camera. So I think it that certainly can do more positive than harm. So let me go into the last one, which I think both of us can talk mostly empirically towards, and we're also running short on time. As to do specifically we use of force, um, there are three elements that I've seen that come up to using of force. The first one is prohibiting officers from using chokeholds or carotid holds, also known as vascular neck restraints or rear naked chokes. The other one said mandate the federal officers, so any officers, I guess, deadly force use only as a last resort, that de-escalation and attempt and condition federal funding and state and local law enforcement agencies on the adoption of the same policy. And last but not least, which is in my mind, the most important, change the threshold of permissible use of force from reasonable to only using to only when necessary to prevent death or serious bodily harm. Um, so I think that's an issue. So let's break it down. I'll start with the easy one, with deadly force. Deadly force is deadly force, and it's very specific in when I can use it, and I can only use it when life of somebody is at risk, mine or somebody else in the public. Think about active shooter. If I cannot take deadly force, then you're prohibiting me from saving, let's say, students' life in an active shooter event at a school, right? We're talking length about active shooters and active assailants on the last podcast, so we're not going to go into that too much. It's always a last resort. I don't have an issue with that. Talking about chokes, right? So to give people a little bit of history behind this rear naked choke, or what's often referred to in law enforcement as LVNR, or lateral vascular neck restraint. On the side of your neck, there are two carotid arteries, right? One on each side, that if I apply pressure on, I stop the flow of oxygenated blood to the brain and the person passes out, right? It's painless. It takes about 5 to 10 seconds, and that person is no longer resistant. To give people history, it used to be very effectively applied by police officers to get people to comply and stop fighting them so we can put handcuff on them and call it a day. Criminal element, being, the smart breed that they are, started faking passing out, knowing that the officer would let go, and they would continue fighting. So police officers at that point, to play it safe, started holding that choke for a little bit longer just to make sure, and that's when some issues started arising. This became a big issue with Eric Garner. right,
Yeah.
where he was placed in
And
rear naked choke. There's other issues. I'm not going to get into the politics of this, but when somebody's yelling that they can't breathe, they can still breathe. Uh, but obviously, there's a lot of misconduct going there as well. Not going to get into it. They took on a negative turn. I do think they are an appropriate tool in the right circumstances. I mean, you and I do jujitsu. It's a tool that is very often used in jiu-jitsu because it gets the other person to submit. You cannot fight if you pass out. It is a good tool. Uh, Used in the right context, in the right environment, under the right situations, I don't think that's a negative thing. What do you think?
again, I thought it was an effective tool. Unfortunately,
You
it comes
still
down
there?
to yeah, I'm here. I'm here. I think it comes down to training, right? We're defunding police. They don't have training budgets. I know as a police officer, I know my personal agency do a good job on it. But most agencies, they probably get 1 day of defensive tactics a year, if that, and in service. There's not enough training going around. And that aside, that tool, great tool as it was, is gone. Officers are afraid to engage now. This is why crime is going up. They're not going to risk their livelihood. Again, if used properly and trained properly, and there are effective training elements out there, being within agencies and or in the civilian sector, like Masada Tactical in itself, it can be used effectively. But like you said, it was taken advantage of. It became a political tool. It was attacked. And anytime you put your arm around someone's neck, whether you're choking them or not, you're choking them. And it's unfortunate.
Yep, 100%. So last, and I think the most concerning to me is when we start judging use of force, not by reasonableness, but by the term what they call necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury. So essentially, what we want to go is after a Supreme Court case called Graham versus Connor, which frames what is reasonable, and essentially the way it's defined is that an action cannot be judged hindsight 2020 based on the information given to an officer at that point in time. Where is action reasonable? And the way it's being judged, in a sense, is whether another prudent officer, given the same information, would have acted in a similar manner. So
Correct.
let's say I go and I hand up affecting force to affect an arrest, right? Somebody's going to complain, and then go to Steve, who's also a police officer, and say, Steve, this is what you know. What would you have done, right? This essentially point, and again, the way I'm reading it, and I am not an attorney, but says, no, Steve's word of Steve saying that this is reasonable is not enough. If it was not necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury, then my action would have been illegal or unlawful. And I think that's an issue because you take a lot of tools away from police officers. You take their ability to use what we call the totality of circumstances, right? All the variable that affects the decision-making point, the decision-making process at that point in time, right? Whether the person is aggressive or not. Is it one person, multiple person, inside, outside? Is it bigger, smaller, trained, untrained, armed, unarmed? All those variables go away, right? And I can no longer judge my actions as if they're being reasonable or not, but only solely on the is it necessary to prevent death or serious injury. I, what if there's no death or serious bodily injury, but I have to use force because that person is extremely combative, is a menace, and I need to effect an arrest. Now I can't anymore. I find the I find this one very disturbing, probably more than all of the other ones.
Absolutely. Because obviously there's so many variables in law enforcement that you don't know. You have no idea what's in someone's pockets, what's in someone's car, what's in someone's home. There's so many variables, and there's always a gun in every call you go on, right? Yours. I unfortunately, after I had retired, and I'm still an active peer counselor, even as a retiree. I just went to training, as you know, and we support the unit ourselves through the gym with physical fitness and whatnot. But I had one of my former officers call me, and he kind of was a victim of this idea because, as you know, it comes from the top down. So the supervisors were criticizing him for his actions, which I saw nothing wrong in his actions. It stemmed from a theft at a store. He saw the vehicle. The vehicle was actively trying to evade this officer, not aggressively, but he said he documented, like, he was obviously trying to get away from the car as best he could, got stuck in traffic, pulls up on the car, is giving commands. They're not complying, so he draws his firearm. Because the windows are tinted. He can't see. He's telling him to roll down his windows. Long story short, they finally comply. He takes him into custody for the theft. He got reprimanded and written up for drawing his firearm because of the time of the day. And based on kind of this ideology of this new policy. And I'm like, but he had no idea. This person aggressively threatened someone's life, the loss prevention officer, aggressively fought people to get away, stole something, and was aggressively driving away. He's locked inside a vehicle with tinted windows. This officer has no idea what's inside that vehicle. He's not complying with his commands. This officer's by himself, standing catty corner to the vehicle, so he draws his firearm to protect himself and as a show of force. Once the windows come down, they comply. He holsters his weapon and takes him into custody. No further incident. But because he drew his weapon, he was criticized and reprimanded for that based on this policy. So I don't agree with it, as you don't. You there? Come in, BK. There you are.
You froze there at the end. Yeah, you
You
froze there at the
froze.
end. We got to work these technological
You
issues.
froze.
I I got you now. I got you now. No, I heard what you said. I just couldn't see you moving. You froze first.
No,
You
you froze.
froze. So
You are. You frozen now.
no, I think
Tell your wife and kids to get
all right.
off
Can you hear me
Wi-Fi.
now?
Tell your wife and kids to get off the
This is
Wi-Fi.
why I keep saying we got to do this in one studio.
We need a dedicated studio.
All right. Steve, we're working on it. We actually are working on it physically. So hopefully this will be resolved soon. So for our listeners, stick with us for a little bit longer. But no, I think you bring a great point with this officer as a good example of if we took reasonableness away, then that would be an issue. Um, all in all, I mean, we are surpassing the 1 hour limit that we just
Yeah, we
we
can
kind
go
of
on.
put for ourselves. I think the case in Memphis is a good example of people taking advantage of their position and going against any kind of policy and anything that you and I agree as instructors and as police officers ourselves, right? I think that was um, an illegal and not to mention unethical and uncivilized behavior. Forget about being a law enforcement, just as a human being. And I think we are in agreement on that. So we'll let the judicial system take its course on that one and see where that leads. But I do want to leave. I want to leave our listeners with one request, and I do recognize that our listeners are from our flock in a sense, and most of them are from our world, and it's preaching to the choir. But if there are listeners that are not first responders, specifically law enforcement officers, don't judge the profession as a whole because of the actions of few. And if you ever want to reach out to any police officers that you know or reach out to us, we'll be more than happy to arrange for a ride along. Come and get a sense for what policing really is, the dangers that police officers deal with on a daily basis, the mundane part of the jobs, and the distinction between fiction or what it seemed to be in the media and the reality. I truly encourage you to do so and give officers the benefit of the doubt. Like we said many times today, the majority of officers, the vast majority of officers, are doing a hard job for very little pay for people that don't appreciate them. And we hope you appreciate what they're trying to accomplish.
Amen. On that note.
All right, Steve, because we're having some technical issues, I'm going to call it a day. Thank you for joining me tonight. Have a good night, buddy. We hope you enjoyed this latest episode. Please go ahead, like our podcast, and subscribe. Check out our YouTube channel as well and follow us on other social media channels.